Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into this special webcast brought to you by Tamil Culture. My name is Jessica Jesudasan. I'm an employment lawyer at DLA Piper Canada here in Toronto, and the occasional host of talks hosted by Tamil Culture, where we chat with members of the Tamil community about issues of relevance and concern to the Tamil diaspora worldwide. I'm joining you right now from the safety of my home here in Toronto, and I hope you guys are all sitting comfortably in your living rooms for what I think should be a very interesting discussion with three members of the Tamil diaspora who have very keen insights on the particular topic that we're going to be chatting about today. So, what are we chatting about today? As I'm sure everyone knows, we're about 2 months into a global pandemic brought on by COVID-19. It's had devastating effects on the economy and on people's livelihoods around the world. And for families in Sri Lanka, trying to make a living under the government-imposed curfew that was brought on in response to COVID-19, times have been particularly tough. So the good news is that in response, there's been an outpouring of initiatives organized by individuals and small groups and organizations from the Tamil community that have tried to bring some relief to those in need back home. However, charitable organizations or charitable initiatives in the Tamil community and in general, whether they're organized informally by individuals or groups, or whether they're organized by larger organizations, do have issues around accountability and transparency. People understandably want to know where their money is going and who it is helping. So the main goal of this discussion today is to help all of you watching at home think about how you can make good decisions about where your hard-earned money is going and where you donate and what cause you're donating to. What should you expect in return from organizations or groups or individuals who solicit your charitable donations, and how can you hold them accountable so that you can be assured that they're doing exactly what they said they would do with your money? These are questions that I personally had myself, and I'm certainly no expert on the topic, but I do have three individuals with me who do have expertise on this. So I'm happy to have them with me here. I'm going to introduce them. I have Abarna Raj, I have Dr. Meera Pathmarajah, and Kumaran Nadesan, and I'll introduce them each in turn. And I'll start with you. Dr. Meera Pathmarajah is a co-founder of Visions Global Empowerment, an international education organization working to enable social change for youth affected by poverty, conflict, and disability through education, leadership, and technology. Meera holds a Master's in International Education Policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a doctorate in International Education from Teachers College, Columbia University. She currently works as the Education Director for an e-learning initiative called Tab School, and she's joining us from Southern California. All right, next we have with us Abarna Raj. Abarna is the founding director of Palmera and has set up and assisted numerous social businesses in Sri Lanka and in Cambodia. In her role, she has also been responsible for the development of fundraising strategies and continues to work and engage a network of volunteers to deliver Palmera's ambitious social objectives. She was formerly a strategy consultant with Social Venture Australia. Prior to that, she held the role of sustainability, diversity, and safety at Leighton Holdings. And Abarna joins us from Sydney. Hello, Abarna. All right, last but certainly not least, we have Kumaran Nadesan. Kumaran is an Ontario public servant, entrepreneur, and founding chair of comdu.it. He has a lengthy track record of community animation, for which he was named a 2018 Diverse City Fellow by the Civic Action Leadership Foundation. He has a Bachelor of Arts in English and Psychology from the University of Toronto and an Executive Certificate in Strategic Public Management from the Schulich School of Business at York University. And Kumaran joins us from Toronto, and I should have said Abarna joins us from Sydney. So thank you all for joining us. How's everybody doing?
Doing well.
Doing good.
Doing
Great.
good. Everybody all set up at home? I'm sure we've all been set up at home for several months now, so this should be nothing new, hopefully.
Just another Zoom meeting today.
Just another Zoom meeting, one of many, one of many.
Feels like it.
All right, so again, thanks for being here with us, everyone. Before we get into this quite a large discussion, what can be a large discussion about transparency and accountability and the future of NGO work in Sri Lanka, I want to learn a bit more about each of your own organizations. So specifically what I want to know, and I think what the listeners and viewers at home want to know, is where your organization's work is focused geographically or regionally in Sri Lanka, why your organization was formed, what its mandate is, and your organization's current initiatives and projects. So I'll start with you, Meera.
Sure. Thank you, Jessica, for this opportunity, and to Tamil Culture also. Visions Global Empowerment has a mission to enable social change through education, leadership, and technology. So our mandate is to build people's capacities so that they become empowered with skills and succeed and move forward in their lives. And really what we've learned is that if you systematically do this, that is build people's capacities, especially by working with them over a number of years, then you not only empower that individual, but you also invigorate institutions. Because when you empower an individual, it has a ripple effect in families, societies, and communities. So our work has been grounded in that aspect of really people-centered development. And our work is currently operating in Jaffna and Batticaloa. But in the past, we've also worked in Trincomalee, Kilinochty, and we did do a large infrastructure project in Colombo. And just to, I mean, the three umbrellas that define our work are education, leadership, and technology. Just to give you a global picture of visions, we operate in 4 countries, in Sri Lanka, India, Ethiopia, and Nicaragua. And since 2003, we've spent $9 million, upwards of $9 million globally, all on educational programs and projects. I should mention that a large chunk of that has been spent recently in Nicaragua, where we're working on a large scale project with a philanthropist. But in Sri Lanka specifically, we've spent a little over $500,000 on various programs, and that impact has reached approximately 18,000 individuals.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
One more thing to note is that our primary target, I guess, beneficiaries are youth, teachers, and staff of organizations. And so Sri Lanka is our only country where we don't have a country office. It's the country where we work purely through partners. And in the last 16 years, we've worked with over 24 partners.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Meera. Okay, Abarna, why don't you tell us a bit about Palmera?
Thanks for this opportunity. So Palmera is head office in Australia, and similar to Vision's work in Sri Lanka, we work with local partners in Sri Lanka. It was a strategic decision to do that so we could build local kind of leadership and local structures. Our mandate and our vision is to enable economic inclusion. So we're really about ensuring that farmers, especially, many of the poor live in rural communities, that they have access to a living income, which is increasingly difficult these days as many people in farming communities work off seasonal labour, so uncertain income, or garment factories where there's very low income paid. So the social enterprises that we set up, the social businesses, the farming communities that we set up enables women, men, families to earn an income with the dignity, the respect, and meeting all their needs, looking after their children, then the environmental sustainability. So it's a holistic approach. Our work really centres in the village, and what we find is that what is needed is a holistic approach to break down all the barriers that prevent the poor from earning income. It's multidimensional. It's not singular. It's not, if they get a cow, then everything will be fine. If they have access to finance, everything will be fine. So we take a systems approach in how we work. We have been operating in Sri Lanka since the tsunami, the 2005 Boxing Day tsunami, as a volunteer-based organisation. In the last 6 years, we've established as a staffed organisation. Our impact is now in the order of about 20,000 people. So we're working across the north and the south and the east. We've scaled rapidly over the last 5-6 years since we've kind of established ourselves as a staffed organisation. Our work is in Sri Lanka. However, we provide technical support in Bangladesh and Nepal through other charities.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Abarna. Okay, Kumaran, let's hear about comdu.it.
Thank you, Jess. I probably have the least to say when there's Visions and Palmera in the room, because we continue to learn a lot from both those organizations. Just incredible work that they do. And it's something that I tell my team all the time, that we need to step up to the standards that Palmera and Visions have set up all of us, just globally, right? So comdu.it, I think every story begins with an intensely personal experience. I spent about 3 months in Kulinichi in 2002 when I was an undergraduate student at the U of T. And that experience of working on the ground, working with multiple people and organizations and having that direct person-to-person contact, I think left a deep impression in my own life in terms of the kind of work that I want to do back home. And really, I mean, it's a long journey, but to sort of cut it short, in 2013, so about 7 years ago, we set up comdu.it as a pilot with two sort of, I think, objectives in mind. One, well, there's one objective in mind. It's to become a sustainable, trusted facilitator or bridge between the diaspora and homeland communities. And the way we wanted to go about doing that is we really felt that when it comes to charity, at least in Canada, it's a very crowded marketplace. There are tons of organizations, whether it's old boys associations, old girl associations, village councils, you know, all kinds of different charity organizations. What was missing in the conversation, we felt, was the whole idea around technical assistance, especially as a new generation grows up in the diaspora who are ethnically Tamil or Tamil speaking. They're also in multiple sectors, multiple verticals in Canada, and there's a lot of knowledge capital that's untapped when it comes to sustainable development back home. So it's about how do we now then create a new path or forge a new sort of prong in terms of diaspora engagement back home through the lens of sustainable development. The second aspect of it is really to try and tell as nuanced a story about back home. When we speak about back home, it's not a monolith. There are so many nuances in terms of the communities, even within one village. You know, there are different socioeconomic sort of, you know, lenses, different regional issues and so on. So how do we make sure that we tell the multiple stories? There is no single story about back home. And the best way to tell those stories is for us to actually be there to the extent that we can and meet as many people on the ground and work with as many different voices and different people on the ground. So over the past 7 years, and we're a completely volunteer-run organization. I won't tell you our budget because it's quite embarrassing given the numbers that I've heard so far and in terms of impact. But I think, you know, in the past 5 years, we've sent about 25 to 30 young professionals. So these are urban planners, doctors, lawyers, social workers, educators. And the main idea is for them to go back and spend at least a month, minimum a month, which is really nothing. We try and push that for longer, to live and work directly with community organizations serving vulnerable populations back home in the north and east, but increasingly vulnerable groups just throughout Sri Lanka.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kumaran. Okay, so I was hoping first that we can just sort of set the stage for everybody about, you know, what's happening back home. So, you know, specifically, what is the current state of charitable work in Sri Lanka from your lens? What works, what doesn't work, what are the issues, and particularly now in light of COVID-19, what does the situation look like for families back home? Abarna, I'm going to throw this one to you. You talked about, you know, working in the village. So what are families back home saying right now? What are they experiencing? What are they feeling?
We've just had the curfews lifted in many of the regions where we work, which is more the rural areas. Obviously, the main urban areas are still under curfew, and there's been a real relief because, of course, buyers now can access, market actors can now come into the areas. A lot of people who sell, you know, fruit and vegetables, these things don't store for very long. They need to have quick access to the market. So there's been a lot of relief so that people can get back into doing work because many people don't have safety nets. You know, just in general, one of your points in how the diaspora is engaging, you know, during the relief time and just before and even now how they're thinking about relief. I think there's always a vetting platform when something like COVID happens. You know, we have to give money now and do a handout and that is really needed. That is really important where people do not have food. These times are also kind of, there's a period of time where that is needed, where that handout is critical. However, over the longer period of time, if those handouts are sustained, it can have very adverse impacts on people. It creates a dependency. It also can create a lot of community conflict because maybe a neighbour is being given a handout, but then the other neighbour is not being given a handout. So what happens in the diaspora community sometimes is different groups may, if sustained for too long, the handout approach can have a lot of adverse impacts. And I think that's where organizations that have a longer term view of development, it's very important to engage with those types of organizations so that things can be done with minimal community conflict and as well their longer term view of how they're going to come stand back on their feet. I think the diaspora has a tendency to say, I gave $10, I want to know where that $10 went. And so I want to know, did it buy Did it go towards a cow? Did it go towards a chicken? Did it go? And that's kind of not how development works. When we look at system changes, we need to look at a holistic approach. And that's why Palmera set up. We found that Diaspora generally didn't give like that. Mm-hmm. They tended to give one-to-one. And I don't think Sri Lanka is in a point now, whether it was post-war, post any natural disaster, or now post-COVID, where that approach is really going to lead to the long-term uplifting of these communities.
Mm-hmm. Kumaran, just following up on that, so it's understandably, like you said, Abarna, you know, the need right now is immediate in light of COVID-19. So there is a time and place for that handout to address specific immediate needs. But even larger than that, just expanding the question broadly, is the current state of charitable work in Sri Lanka, even beyond COVID-19, Kumaran, do you feel that it's still very much a handout by handout kind of approach?
I think there's probably a little bit more progression in terms of the charitable sector in Sri Lanka than we like to think of from the diaspora or give credit for. But there are a couple of things. I mean, I personally felt that there are 2 points I want to make in terms of this question, Jess. One is, I think the long-standing issues that sort of impact this sector, whether it's in Sri Lanka or whether the way the diaspora gives or has given in the past, I don't think the fundamental issues have really changed as a result of COVID-19. I think COVID-19 just amplifies those kinds of issues. So even in sort of like, you know, we ran a fundraiser campaign to Abarna's point, I think people are so used to giving sort of emotionally and spontaneously that it was a runaway success for us. But just from behind the scenes, as much as we could, we try to really sort of cut down on existing problems that sort of rose to the top, which is, you know, duplication, lack of coordination, lack of transparency sometimes, you know, intercommunal community conflicts that Abarna pointed to. So all of these things happen. So I feel, as Abarna has said, that the kind of giving that we saw during COVID-19 and those kinds of things just amplify the issue. And we really need to focus on the long-term sustainable piece. And that's got to do equally with how we in the diaspora rethink giving. And I think it's inevitable this is going to happen because there's a new generation coming up that are not, you know, that didn't go to St. John's or St. Patrick's or Burnaby or any of these places. They are looking at a really, you know, hardcore, what's the return on investment? Like, I've lost track of the conversations I had on Instagram with people messaging me saying like, so what's the return on investment? What can I expect to see in terms of reporting? And we welcome that. Like that's exactly where this is going to go. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was sort of a wake up call to really kind of double down on everything that we were doing prior to COVID-19 from an organizational perspective and really like build on that for the next 4 years as part of a new strategic plan. Mm-hmm. So I would just echo the fact that COVID-19 just amplifies existing issues, which part of that is this charitable giving, like Abarna's point, cannot go on forever. We really have to kind of make that pivot to sustainable development and sustainable giving and return on investment in that sense.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point because like you said, I mean, even prior to COVID-19, the Tamil community has been very active in charitable work and donating to a variety of causes back home. And some of those efforts, you know, they are organized on an individual level, whether it's just an individual to a group of people that are sending money back home, for example, through a priest or through a church or through someone they trust, or whether that be through larger organizations such as your own. But regardless of the scale of that charitable effort, donating money for causes back home does create issues around transparency, the impact of that donation, accountability. Like you said, but like you both said so far, people want to know where their $10 is going, and if 75 cents didn't go to it, where did that go? You know, there's a lot of that, and I think part like you mentioned, Abarna, part of that might not be an understanding of what development long term would look like in Sri Lanka. So I think, you know, common questions that people do have when they're donating is, I mean, how do I know that my money reached its intended cause? How much of my donation went directly to that cause and didn't get lost, an example, for overhead? Should people be informed of that if it was going to overhead? And where can they get all that information? So go ahead, Abarna.
I think one of the things that we've tried to do is sometimes those conversations can make it very challenging for an organization to operate, you know. So what we've tried to do in Palmera is have people understand how Palmera works. So the conversation isn't at that micro level, that they trust the organization, they understand what the organization stands for, that we you know, if we don't hire good people, we're not going to do good work. So we try to create relationships where people understand that this is why we have the people overheads. You know, overheads is what you need to operate. If you don't have, you know, we collect data. Yeah. We collect impact data on our phone. That's how we can report very quickly and efficiently. Therefore, we need to buy a tablet so data can be collected quickly. A tablet costs money. There needs to be offline and online solutions. So if we just spend every single dollar in the delivery, then it's not going to be an effective delivery. So I think the conversation on overheads is an important one. But what we've tried to do at Palmera is try to have our donors understand who we are as an organization, what we stand for, and how we give. And therefore, I think it's important when people give to look at the projects that they give to, but also look at the organization who they give through. And they may not like an organization like Palmera, and that's okay, because that might not kind of meet what their giving expectations are. And so I think it's important for organizations to not be, you know, too worried about doing good work and meeting the donors' needs, but putting the development work first and doing what it takes to have good development and finding the donors who understand that. And that's kind of what we've done with our fundraising strategies.
Meera, how would you say your organization deals with those kind of questions? I'm sure you get them too. How do you address them? How do you respond to people that want to know where their money's going?
Yeah, I share what Abarna said as far as this need to recognize that any strong operation or organization is going to have some level of overhead. And I think the more you see diaspora organizations coming into being, the more they are hopefully will recognize that you can't always expect this to be done on a volunteer capacity. So what we do, I mean, we take accountability very seriously, and we have our ways of reporting. So, you know, quarterly newsletters go out, annual reports happen, and every donor, it's not unusual that you'll hear directly from a scholarship student who sends an email to our donors. So we try to, you know, provide those pictures and so on. The challenge, one of our challenges specifically for Visions has been that both myself and Greg, the co-founder of Visions, have been denied visas to Sri Lanka for the last, since the end of the war. So our presence on the ground has been limited, and therefore we've had to rely on our partners to send us the pictures. And I think because the NGO world is still in so many ways growing, the understanding about donor reporting and the need for pictures and sending reports on time and so on, and also a lack of capacity in terms of bandwidth, it's been a challenge, certainly a challenge. But I think, you know, like Abarna said, a lot of times donors give to a project because they have a connection to it. And if you were to review, I think, Vision's overall history, I hope that we would present as a credible organization. And if you are so inclined to give to an organization that's purely focused on education and empowerment, then you know, try out an organization, because you would never know until you give in and feel that experience of being a donor.
You mentioned having to do the majority of your groundwork through partners. Are those partners local organizations in Sri Lanka? Are they other NGOs? Or?
Right, so it's a mix of other NGOs, also schools, institutions, and then we, in the last decade, we've partnered heavily with Church of American Law and Mission, which I'm sure many in Toronto are familiar with, Darshan Ambalavarnar, who's involved in that. And we worked with him on after school care projects for a good 5 years and saw a lot of strong results. Some children from villages who were passing the O-level in villages that had never had such results, and just scores improving across the board. But because of a lack of real kind, I think, you know, visibility in terms of donors were not meeting that need. And I think one of the challenges is that there's a heavy focus on wanting to give towards projects based in Jaffna, and we've faced that here in the US among our donors as well. Somehow our projects with CACM have not always gained traction. So we did withdraw our funding or end our funding after 5 years of supporting the after school programs. But we are supporting right now a women's empowerment program with CACM, and it's a really incredible program that I think if people were to look into it, I'm sure it would speak to many people. So
I think the conversation about working with partners in Sri Lanka, for example, comdu.it. I know Kumaran, comdu.it released an appeal for vulnerable communities in Sri Lanka, and you also released an appeal that listed other organizations in Sri Lanka that people could reach out to. So how does your work with those smaller organizations look like? What does it look like?
I'd like to sit here and tell you a story, Jess, about how just perfect it is and how we have these objective measures of partnership and all of that. None of that is the case. It is still very much a trial and error method on our part, and I would say on the part of many organizations in terms of finding the right partner fit. When we began through the age-old sort of tradition of trusted networks. We went with people that had a track record in terms of the work that they were doing already. Just having an organization sort of asking questions about a local partner from different vantage points, and if you hear a consistent narrative about an organization, then I think more or less it's a pretty good organization for us to work with. Ideally, though, we would like to get to a place where I'm a romantic at heart and an optimist, maybe foolhardy sometimes. But I think ideally, if we can, as especially the sort of the next generation of organizations in the diaspora working back home, to come up with a unified sort of partnership criteria. And unified sort of organizational sort of strategies and frameworks, that we can then get participants in Sri Lanka to subscribe to as well. Then I think we'll get closer and closer to an objective understanding of who's doing what, where is the help needed, who can take on what issue, and so on. So at this point, our partnership model is evolving. I'll grant you that much, but it's still very much a sort of a trusted network. Who's doing what and where, what's their track record in this work, and kind of go from there. The one thing I do want to point out, though, is I wouldn't necessarily sort of look on trusted partnerships as sort of kind of in a disdainful kind of manner, because it sometimes works. A year ago, a few of us put together a simple thing, a WhatsApp group that really kind of brought together organizations in Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US who are working sort of on the charity development side of things. And for me, it was really kind of nice to understand what kind of impact that can have, because when COVID-19 happened, like there were conversations that happened in that WhatsApp group. We caught like duplication that was happening. There was an opportunity to kind of do work in an entirely different community that a few people in the group were interested in. So we kind of branched out and had a conversation about that. So I think that kind of coordination and increased coordination in the diaspora, and then kind of having those kinds of expectations or a common set of expectations that we then have of local partners will also help us, I think, in the long run. I don't even know if I answered the question, but trusted partnerships. Trusted
partnerships. I got it. This kind of leads into the next question I had too, because like I mentioned, on the community level, on an individual level, there are just sports teams and small groups of people that have gotten together that I've seen here in Toronto, particularly to address the need that's resulted from COVID-19. And their efforts are very informal, understandably so. So what would you say to those individuals or those groups that want to be able to be accountable to their contributors, want to be transparent, but maybe don't have the resources or aren't formally set up to hand over a spreadsheet should someone ask? How can they create that accountability, that transparency? Abarna, I'll put that one to you.
One of the things that Palmera has done is we've created on our website a crowdfunding page where people who are groups who fundraise, of which there are many all through globally and in Australia. And actually we raise about, I would say 20% of our funds this way, where people go up onto our website. They then set up a page if they're doing a sporting event, if they're doing a birthday. We call it do-it-yourself campaign. It's really simple, it's really easy. We make the front end, we give you a link, they get their tax receipts. We manage all the back end for you. So that means they have the confidence that we have accreditation, we have the structures in place, that they know where their money is going to. We've designed the project in the right way. They select their own projects. So our website has two different crowdfunding platforms, one where you can load your page and one where you can select the project that you want. If you're interested in more women focused, more child focused, And what we found is we started to get some traction on this. There is sometimes people are getting used to working in a collaborative way like this. The thought of maybe an Australian organisation giving to another Australian organisation that then gives to a Sri Lankan organisation, it's kind of changing that chain of events that normally occurs. But what we're trying to establish is that there is a role for, in order to create that transparency, it's very difficult if you're a fundraising organisation that doesn't have the time or the expertise to then work with a local organisation and expect from them the things that one would expect. At Palmera, we have budget for capacity development, we have budget and teams and experts that can support in the monitoring and evaluation, write the reports in a way that someone in the Western world would want to see a report, which is very difficult and adds a lot of cost to local partners when you create that expectation. The local partner needs to be on the field. That's their expertise, localization, designing solutions, getting them behind a computer, writing English with the right words and the photo in the right way and the positioning of the photo. That's not their skill. They're not marketers, you know? And so I think it's easier for a Palmera to do that than to expect the local partner to do that. So we're really trying to grow this and trying to kind of have people rethink what is their role. You know, is it a fundraising role? Is it a programming role? Is it a working indirectly with Sri Lanka role? And trying to have that type of conversation with organizations. And it seems to be working well.
Yeah, it sounds like you've created something of a network of accountability while working through these smaller organizations. I mean, they arguably are somehow a little bit, they can say that they're somehow more credible or more transparent or accountable through an organization like Palmera by working through an organization like Palmera.
If I may add something to what Abarna said, I mean, to go back to your question, Jess, I mean, my hypothesis, at least at this point, is the kind of giving that you asked about, the smaller groups, whether it's, you know, old student associations or village councils and all of that, that I think is going to die out, you know, unless you have, but, you know, kinds of the things that Abarna is doing. I mean, I can't speak for all the diasporas. I can can't speak for the Canadian diaspora, but I have a little bit more familiarity with it. I think that generation is just going to fade away. And I think the opportunity, and this is why I think there is a place for all of us in the value chain, and this is not a shameless plug for comdu.it, maybe it is, but I think the opportunity for us with comdu.it is how do we kind of refresh or renew the relationship that people have to the land back home, you know, because they didn't go to those schools, they weren't born in those villages. So like, how do we make that conversation sort of stick with the next generation? And I think I'm of the firm belief that, and this is biased because of my own experience, is that I think there is a need to go back and to understand where you come from, what your heritage is, what your history is. And I think Tamil identity and identity to that country, despite as many flaws, consistent flaws and persistent flaws, is crucial. Because I think once you get that sort of affinity to understand where you come from, then the opportunity to give back and to shape a different narrative in terms of giving through organizations like Palmera or Visions or whoever just becomes even more stronger. But I think the model as it stands now, should no one go back, should no one actually take an active interest and see what's going on, it would mean there's going to be a very deep drop in donor giving. Unless, of course, you have COVID-19. And that's the worst way to think about this, right? Mm-hmm. You shouldn't have to have a humanitarian disaster to be able to kind of like give, right? So mm-hmm. You know, whether it's, I'm just throwing out names, right? Like whether it's the Karai Nagar village, Ondriam, Ondriam, or I don't know, Cookville Hindu College, like those organizations with respect to their membership and the way they give, it's going to become obsolete in the next 10 years. And that's being charitable on my part.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point, Kumaran, because
I don't agree though.
Let's hear it.
I mean, I've seen, you know, these organizations now since the time of the war when they were sending out relief. You see these groups and they're still sending out the backpacks and providing food relief during COVID. And there's this sentiment that I don't think is the children who have been born here in the West. It's people who have spent some time there, have made it out here professionally. And that sentiment is strongly there. And I'm always heartened when I see that so much activity is happening. I don't see them as competitors. I see them as potential collaborators. And the only missing issue is that we're not aware of so many things that are happening. And I think that's something that perhaps our generation could figure out, is better ways of coordinating, and so that we have visibility to all the different things that are happening, and that we can then leverage work and connect people. But you know, for example, Ramoshan is a guy here in the Bay Area who has started a company, and Vetri Holdings. Vetri Holdings has then employed people in Jaffna to create a local company there. Arogya Life is one of them. So visions, you know, these are kind of smaller individuals that have created now a company out there, and there's kind of a partnership that's happening where Visions has supported scholarships for students to attend coding camps and then find employment in his company. And that's the kind of networking. If it could happen more, then we could, you know, make use of all of our connections. And I agree, Kumaran, that in probably 20 to 30 years, we might see a reduction of this. But to me, the desire to give back is alive and well, especially among those who, you know, are our age, but they spent some time living in Sri Lanka.
I think that's the key point, Meera, that you just made. Have they spent that time in Sri Lanka? Because I think there's an interesting nuance you brought, which I agree with, which I think there's a sort of very broadly put, there's an intersection with class here, right? Like in terms of like the people who are part of like some of the village-owned dreams and all of that, their sort of the diaspora journey and their trajectory in terms of their immigration journey is quite different from people who then went to schools in Colombo or Peradeniya or Moratuwa or Jaffna and then immigrated for work reasons to the US or Canada or Australia. I think those people, having lived and also sort of, you know, spent time, will keep giving, as you said. And Ramoshan is a wonderful example of that. I'm very impressed with Ramoshan and the way he does work. But I think if you look at the generation that fled outright as refugees from Sri Lanka, who came to places like Toronto, I think more like to places like Toronto, and then they kind of joined their as part of sort of social cohesion, they joined their village councils or they went to their old, you know, schools and all of that. Will that generation, I'm speaking about that generation, and how will their kids then kind of take that on? But you know, but there are nuances here for sure.
I'll just jump in there because I do think, you know, whether it's the generation past or the generation present, a lot of our identity as a Tamil diaspora from Sri Lanka is very much linked to the Civil War. And I think a lot of people's want and need to give back and do something back home is very linked to that. So, you know, even in the midst of COVID-19, the needs that the war has presented are still very much present. You know, the war's ended 11 years ago, and families are still struggling with that. And the reason I bring that question up is because there's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done. Yes, with COVID, but also to support those war-affected individuals back home. And this is kind of tied to, you know, people's political ideologies about the conversation around what charitable giving looks like back home, the politics around charitable giving. What does support look like back home? This is kind of a loaded question in a lot of ways, and I acknowledge that, but you know, what does that quote unquote support look like in light of the varying ideologies and you know, and opinions that people have on giving back home? Abarna, I'll put that one to you.
You know, I think this once again links to the organization you're connected with. Palmera is a non-political, non-religious organization. We don't support any local partners that have a religious agenda or a political agenda. You know, we don't support anything that's linked to even during this COVID, we have elections coming up in Sri Lanka. So a lot of giving, whether people knew it or not, was linked to people who were trying to promote their campaign, because, you know, by giving out food at this time, we would promote their campaign. Palmera asked a lot of questions around that. And, you know, we started up during the war. We were heavily criticized by the language we use, the way we look and feel, because we take this stance. Why do we do it? We do it because we are trying to tap an audience. We're not trying to take from the existing pool. We want to we want to expand the pool. And at least in Australia, the pool, there is a big pool that do not want to be politically and religiously affiliated. If you do, don't come to our organization. It's not the organization to come to. There's another organization that does have stronger political ideologies, and that's the organization to go to. I think, you know, we're working in an ecosystem, in a landscape in the diaspora, where we each can play a role and we each understand our role. Not everyone has to look like the other person. You know, we get so many criticisms because we don't use certain words and we're not like Tamil enough, and you know, and it's just the experience of Australian Tamils. It's a little bit different. Most our donor base, I would say 90% have never been to Sri Lanka. 60% probably don't want to go to Sri Lanka. You know, 40% are probably involved in interracial marriages and have a different type of identity. So it's
Abarna,
not to say
I will ask you if, just to put a question to you here, but because, you know, like you said, Palmera's work is very much systems oriented. You know, it is about the long-term effect of the work that you're doing. Doesn't that necessarily, like, even a little bit tie into politics, a little back home?
Oh, it does, but it's a different type of politics. For us, it's about strengthening people's voice. It's about having people have rights. It's about people working in mobilized communities so that they don't feel fear to stand up to whether it be a government official or whether it be a market actor, whether it be a buyer who's trying to take advantage of them. That's what's disintegrated. So that grassroots kind of people feeling confident and knowing how to express themselves. You know, in the recent elections when they increased the quota of women to 25%, many of people in our program were asked to stand for election because they had had the training and the confidence, they knew what they stand for, but we don't tell them what to stand for. You know, it's giving those base skills back, getting rid of that fear, but Palmera doesn't have a political ideology that we are trying to push in every program that we're trying to do. And that's the important piece about Palmera, but that's not to say that's the right thing. It's just that that's what we stand for. So donors, when they give, should really understand the organization, what the organization stands for, and not trying to make every organization be the same. Because I think that was the challenge of the giving in the past and the older generations. There was kind of like you had to fit in the box. And I think there's an opportunity now that there can be a lot of different types of boxes in the ecosystem.
Right. I think that's a lot of people struggle with deciding where to give, or, you know, like whether they can feel good about giving, you know, that uncertainty about what it might be tied to, whether they know it or not. I think a lot of people want to give without necessarily being tied to some sort of political ideology, but as it is in our town community, sometimes these things touch on each other without us fully intending it. So, Kumaran, I know you've definitely had opinions on this, and people have had things to say in response. So, if you don't mind, Kumaran, I'm gonna just paraphrase
oh, good God.
a Facebook post that you had posted, which I think is very
in a non-comdu.it capacity, but I understand the responsibility of visibility as well. So
okay, I'll paraphrase it. So I'm going to short it down a little bit, but you said, "I have no desire to shed any crocodile tears this week, as I remain critical today, as I was since I was a teenager, of the inherent contradictions, flaws, and convenient jingoism of the policy framework underpinning armed militancy within Tamil nationalism. But I thought I'd ask a question of my well-intentioned community colleagues, homegrown activists, now parachuting in from other places and spontaneous Instagram hacktivists. When do you plan to raise your voice publicly and push for legal redress against those Canadian citizens who became overnight millionaires in our community on May 18th, 2009? Or is it too inconvenient to individual and organizational, political, social, and economic ambitions? Or is the web of family and friends, social media, and the dinner dance gala circuit too restrictive for you?" For those who have the context, quite a pointed post. For those without the context, you might have to explain it. So tell us, give us your thoughts briefly. What were you thinking when you said that?
I think that post came at the end of a very tiring month. I probably should have reflected on that before I posted it, but I think it comes after kind of seeing really how challenging it can be sometimes to get people to donate money for even charitable work back home. And to also then see, as you give money back home, just sort of the web of interplay between diaspora actors and influence, and I'm just as much a part of that, and how it sort of permeates and impacts on the ground. this is sad to say, and I leave out names and all of that, but in one of the provinces, we picked a very sort of vulnerable group that has also become highly politicized, I think, because of issues around transitional justice and so on over the last 5 years, especially. And just to kind of get who's actually working on helping these families in this area, what is your organization doing? I really had spent like tons of time on that, and that kind of really tells me that there's a lot of sort of interference, involvement, engagement in the diaspora that sometimes plays out in these ways that we don't anticipate. But the essential point that I was trying to make is there is hundreds of millions of dollars, and there is a report by the International Crisis Group, save aside its own biases, where the number has been estimated, on average around 2 to 3 billion US. That's kind of sitting around, right? Probably even more. The point is, where is that money, and how can we best tap into that to kind of help people back home? Even if we were to extend the argument that it was collected on the premise that this was meant to help Tamil-speaking people, especially, gain autonomy in terms of political independence, economic independence, and social independence. If that is the case, those outcomes for Tamil people in Sri Lanka are still a valid thing today. So be it the instrument of sort of achieving that objective, or the pathway, with the Tamil Tigers especially, may have gone, but the realities of people, political, economic, and social realities still persist, and the outcomes we want for them still persist. So why can't that money still be tapped into to get that? So the point was essentially about these people who I believe, and once again, my Zoom says comdu.it, but we'll see how this plays out. But I think my point is, what responsibility do these people have, mostly individuals and business leaders have, in making sure that we at least give a percentage of that money that is still hidden in terms of assets that the Tamil community gave, and a lot of people gave. And it's not just, and not to pick on Meera, it's not just rich doctors in the US who gave that money, or rich, whatever engineers in the US. It's like the working class in Toronto gave money. Working class in Sydney and Melbourne gave money. So there's an obligation, I think, that we as a community have to question where that money is and how do we get that money, and to really make that money count for what it was collected in the first place for. That's a lot.
Anybody have a response to that? They want
I may have to go into hiding after this.
I mean, I think, well, here's a question for all of you that just sprung to my mind after hearing Kumaran. Do you think our generation, this generation that's presently in the West, maybe born here or moved here very young, are we sort of becoming more and more disconnected to the need back home, beyond that immediate giving to put food on the table kind of donation? Are we losing sight of that systemic, that system sort of development that Sri Lanka still needs as we become more successful here in the West and become more preoccupied with our own lives? Are you noticing that trend, anyone?
I think for Australia, it's in some ways it's easy to raise money. In some ways, it's very difficult to raise money. We have I think a less crowded marketplace for our generation of giving. So in some ways, it's easier. But it's a very integrated community. A lot of people came here a long time ago, so identity is very low. The Sri Lankan Tamil community is a bit more of a passive community here, and in that, in order they've integrated very well to do well in their careers. So kind of making their identity known, even if it's affiliating strongly with a Sri Lankan charity that has a lot of Tamil members in it, is something that they are worried about, I think. And while it may not be said, I think that identity is the changing identity is making it challenging to raise funds. It's quite interesting. There's a dynamic happening here in Australia where I feel like the people who are Tamil, who are born in Australia, feel very almost stronger in their Tamil identity, because no one can say you're not Australian because they're born in Australia. While those of us that were born in Sri Lanka, we're kind of like, oh no, we're actually not Australian. So you're right in a way. While the Tamil Australians that are born in Australia, they're so confident in their Tamil identity, but the way they define their Tamil identity, what that means and how that expresses itself, I don't find it necessarily expresses itself through charitable giving in Sri Lanka, which is just one mode of expressing your Tamil identity. I think that link between, just because you don't give doesn't mean you don't have a strong identity. You can have a strong identity. You can be involved in music and, you know, have visual representations that have a link to Tamil identity. A lot of people here wear the pottu, you know, and things like that, that I think there wouldn't be many people in my generation that would be comfortable to do that necessarily. But here there's such a strong Tamil identity, but I think the link to the giving is what's gone here in Australia. And how do we get that back? How do we create a burning platform when Sri Lanka is being said in, you know, in the global sphere that it is now an upper middle class country? How do we show that these systemic issues still exist in a way that people can understand it? And so that's with being respectful to the people over there, because sometimes when I see that everyone is starving, you know, the headlines that come out during COVID in order to get the money, that's also not the right way to do it. So these are challenging things.
And I mean,
Meera, you had a thought as well. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to, what Abarna was saying kind of sprang to mind. Visions was started as a volunteer organization where we took international volunteers and we went and spent time in children's homes, literally in the same accommodation with, you know, we had our own rooms, but we spent time 2 weeks at a time, 3 weeks at a time. And it was such a transformative experience for all of the volunteers. And you hear this all the time about volunteer organizations that, you know, have that cultural exchange piece. But I think, you know, that's a program that Visions hopefully can revive in the future, because that time on the ground, spending even, you know, especially for people who have never been or spent that kind of time with disadvantaged children or youth communities makes all the difference. That's one point I wanted to make. And we still do that right now with our other countries. It's just Sri Lanka hasn't allowed for that. You had asked, is there a disconnect? And I kind of strongly feel yes. I mean, look at our dialogue today. The four of us, you know, we're living here. There's not a representative from Sri Lanka in this conversation about development in Sri Lanka. And I think there is a need to consistently try to understand what the needs and emotions of people in Sri Lanka, in Jaffna, in Kalanachi, in whichever area it is, do a lot of listening work, a lot of dialogue work, so that we can respond in a meaningful way, and rise to meet the needs. And we'll never go wrong with, I mean, there's still in this 10 years, 11 years after war, still a need for people to find their next meal. And so that work has to happen. Like I said earlier, coordination efforts need to improve. But as from an education perspective, what we've seen is, and COVID has brought this out, you have so many layers of disadvantage. Today, not having a laptop means you probably aren't, you know, you're not getting an education at the moment. And so those kind of, I guess, traditional handouts, we can also see in a kind of new form coming out today, where handing out laptops, you're never going to go wrong. Because imagine your life without a laptop today. You can't function, right? And the moment you give an individual, a youth, someone who's going to college, a laptop, you change their life forever. And we've done this now, we've given technology. That's one of the things we want to prioritize, and we do, especially to organizational leaders. Laptops, PowerPoint, projectors, iPads. So all these tools go a long way in equipping people.
So
if
I think
just do a quick follow-up, Jess.
Sure.
Like, I couldn't agree more with what Meera just said in terms of the disconnect. What I would offer, though, is I think disconnect is the best case scenario. I think what is more prone to happen is the echo chamber effect, where as a result of the disconnect, our ideas of what is needed back home, and really the idea that people back home have of us, those ideas will just keep amplifying and growing. And we kind of, and this is, I mean, not to make this all political all the time, but this is one of the reasons I really feel that sometimes we are we do navel gazing in terms of even sort of the political trajectory of the Tamil sort of situation, right? Because we don't have that relationship with what's going on back home. And this is one of the reasons why I think I feel very strongly, as I did when we started comdu.it 7 years ago, is as you increase the people-to-people connections and touch points, that exchange of information, that exchange of communication and awareness is really going to lead to more robust, holistic, informative, bi-directional exchanges and conversation that can help bring about new development outcomes and new political outcomes and new economic outcomes. I do think there is a disconnect, but I don't think, and to go back to Abarna's point, it's the same thing in Canada. The kids who grow up here have a strong sort of affinity towards Tamil culture and identity, which is incredible. But the thing is, a lot of that is still kind of in many ways seen through a political lens and a specific political narrative. How do you make that more democratic and more open and more, holistic, right? Like there are other, so how do we make sure that these young people, as they want to understand their Tamil identity, know there is no such thing as a Tamil identity. There is no singular story of that identity. And it's for each one of us to talk to as many people as we can on the ground and be in touch with as many people on the ground to understand and get what we want out of that for our own work in our life. Mm-hmm. I feel very strongly, but sorry, I had to interject on that. But I agree with Meera in terms of the disconnect for sure.
Yeah, great points all around. I think obviously being on the ground, that in-person connection is really important. But I do think that can raise other questions and other issues. For example, the accusation that you might be a brown savior, right? Someone who is from the West, quite well off, has done well for themselves, and is now going back with idealistic views to change Sri Lanka for the better, that kind of thing. I think a lot of people's concerns with maybe some programs might be that people come into the village, they do good work for a few months or a year, and then they leave. And then what does that mean for the people back home in those villages that, like we all intended, built a relationship with those people, and then they left? How does that look? To your point, Abarna, that children are starving headline, that's not a good headline either. And sometimes I think that might be the kind of headline that brown saviors, quote unquote, get accused of putting out there. So has anyone been called a brown savior? Can I ask that? Kumaran is nodding vigorously. Okay.
Oh, we face those accusations all the time in terms of being a brown savior, right?
How do you respond to them? How do you address it?
Short of like showing them the kind of work that we do before anyone gets on a plane at Pearson, there is no way to respond to that. People don't see the hard work that we do or the work that we do in preparing people for even getting on the plane to go back in the first place. They don't see the orientations that we have, the briefings that we have, the kinds of demands we place on people who are selected to go, the expectations we have of them once they come back in terms of debriefing and how they, what expectations we have in terms of them continuing to engage. They don't see any of that. They go down, and this is one of the reasons why we've actually cut down on a lot of the social media photos and all of that stuff, because they can take a photo and they can make multiple narratives out of that. But I think the brown savior complex, I think, is generally a valid, I think, concern in terms of this kind of development work, right? In terms of how people come in and go out. But yeah, I think it's, we've had mixed results. Like we've had people who we've sent who spend time and are still engaged, and their work is amplified, and they've managed to sort of get an understanding of the identity better, and they're not even part of comdu.it anymore. Some of them have even disassociated with comdu.it, but it kind of triggered a thinking for them that I think has persisted in terms of other kinds of work that they want to do, which is great. But then we've also had people who kind of went and came back, and we haven't heard from them since then. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I mean, this is a conversation I've had with Darshan all the time, who's a mentor, and Meera knows him very well, and he's one of our dear friends. And one thing he told me is, you can't control that. And it was a great lesson in being a dad, I guess, for me, an early lesson. That sounds very patriarchal, but what I mean is, you can only do so much to kind of make sure that you give people an opportunity to have an experience that is equitable and co-created with local partners that you hope will stick with them and have a transformative effect either now or as in my case, germinated, in me for a very long time until I decided to express it in an organizational way many years later. But you have no control of that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only do what you can, and then the rest of it, you really don't have any control over.
Abarna, how do you and Palmera address that concern or remain cognizant of it in your work?
I really applaud that comdu.it started the organization they did, because I think there's a real need for this. But as Kumaran said, you need to have the resources to manage it completely end to end. And Palmera, we decided that we didn't have it. And so we had too many examples where we couldn't manage that end-to-end process because we had the development work as well. And so we decided to kind of not continue with the volunteer program. And instead we do what we call a village experience, which is a 1-week village immersion. And it is for people who give already and who are long-term givers. And we want to kind of develop that type of relationship. They go into the village, they stay in the village with the people for 5 days. And that we found for us, therefore we can ensure they have a complete narrative, even though they're there just for 5 days, and they can go and be true ambassadors because they've got the full picture. They haven't just got one side of the picture. In Sri Lanka, I think that there is a risk, especially as people are now traveling back and forth. They go to Colombo, they go up to A9, they go to Jaffna, they pass areas, they see a couple of things, and then they come and say a whole bunch of stuff, So I think this is going to be an increasing risk now that there's increasing access to the area. And there's a lot of different narratives out there. There's so many narratives, and I think there's going to be more confusion as to what is the truth. Is everyone starving, or is everyone doing really well, or is everyone, what's happening here? So I think that once again, for me, it's coming back to what organization, what people are you connected to, what's that message, what do you trust, like anything where there's confusing and conflicting messages.
Mm-hmm. Meera, what about you? How does Vision's Global Empowerment deal with that accusation, if it's been levied against you, of the brown savior complex?
I personally, I don't think brown savior complex is a very appropriate phrase, just because white savior complex is tied to so much narrative around colonization and its history. So maybe my academic side doesn't want to easily transfer that phrase. But I think what it's pointing to is a power differential that unless an organization is willing to interrogate, is headed for disaster. So it's a reality that us sitting in the West are privileged in this position that we're in. And the moment we get touch ground on Sri Lanka, there's a power differential. It plays out. I guess practically, one change in our organization has been that in recent times, we've converted our volunteer model into a partnership with universities, so that going to Ethiopia so far, and soon to be India, is an immersive experience as part of a semester-long course. So you have a lot of preparation around it. But to do it as part of the volunteer experience is something that I think we, would take seriously as far as a lot of education process, as Kumaran mentioned, and as Abarna said, I would not like to echo comdu.it's efforts in creating an environment where we can have long-term volunteer placements, because that is a huge, change altogether. To spend at least 6 months or longer in a place is a very different approach than spending a couple weeks. And I guess I want to plug the reality that these kind of conversations, if they're happening within organizations, it's important, because I don't think that space exists. You have to really search hard for it in Sri Lanka, even among high school students, colleges, and it's people like Darshanam Abarna who have an international education really, and are globally minded, that bring that conversation to youth, and it's so powerful. So again, I had mentioned earlier, Elual is a program that is allowing women for 1 year to engage 6 months of English training and then 6 months of simple reflection, which is something that rarely happens before they go on, after they've completed their A-level. And so I think reflection has to happen there. It has to happen here. And, we'll see how things turn out in the decades to come.
I think the decades to come will be that test for our generation, really, as members of the Tamil diaspora. Go ahead,
and just if I didn't say it, I know it's always understood. I mean, we haven't touched on the fact that all of this work happens under still the securitization aspect of Sri Lanka itself, right? Like a lot of this work. I mean, Meera is an example of that vision. I mean, she can't travel to Sri Lanka, and that has security implications and all of this nonsense, right? So there is that whole sort of elephant in the room that we also have to negotiate with on a day-to-day basis, and that is a challenge in itself. I mean, we're having sort of inside the house conversation here, but comdu.it not for a single minute forgets that there is a larger framework that we have to operate under, and that comes with having very serious conversations about a lot of different topics that impact day-to-day programming for us on the ground. And not all of it, and not for all those conversations, it's very easy to kind of beat my Tamil chest and be proud. And if I don't get to do the work, what is the point at the end of the day? At least, right, on a personal level. But yeah.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, I think a lot of those realities that you all face in your organizations working in Sri Lanka don't hit us back home in our living rooms, when we're just thinking about where we want to give our money and whether every dollar and every cent is going to exactly where we, directly to a family. Understanding that bigger picture is something that I don't think the Tamil public really fully knows, but it's been excellent hearing from all of you to understand that bigger picture and understand what your overarching goals are, and how this is not just like you said, just a meal to meal kind of effort. This is a larger systemic development effort, and I really commend all of you for putting in that emotional labor and that time and that energy into it. I can't imagine it's easy. I seriously, literally cannot imagine it. So I have the utmost respect for all of you for doing that. I want to end off by putting it to you again, each of you. If you had to give a one and a half minute kind of pitch to potential contributors or donors or people that are on the fence or have these hesitancies about donating through large organizations in Sri Lanka, or just donating to charities or causes in Sri Lanka in general. If you had a message to give to them, what is that message? Abarna, let's start with you.
Since doing this and since the end of the war, how I see it is, especially in the north, Palmera works through the country, but specifically in the north, I really feel we're at a crossroads. I feel like, in this next generation, we don't fix some of the deep-rooted social challenges, this whole race is going to go in a completely different direction. I think we have one generation, 20, 30 years to fix the devastation that's happened and the flow-on effect of this next generation. If they go one generation and we don't change that curve, it would be really sad to see what ends up happening. And so I feel like for Palmera, that's kind of our mission. And that's the burning platform that we share to our donors. So anyone who's listening, yes, the war's over, yes, COVID's over, and yes, there will be another disaster of some sort, but don't wait for that. I think there's a bigger issue, and I think we all have the responsibility to make sure that curve shifts.
Definitely. Meera, what's your message to donors or potential donors?
I would just reiterate the cliche that education is the gift that keeps on giving. And when you invest in a person's abilities, their skills, their capacities, you're making a meaningful difference for them. And we've seen the outcome of this. We've worked with people for a long term, and we don't do the one-off, small project here and there. We have people in our network of beneficiaries who have been with us for 10 years, and we've seen them grow from a leadership training student to training other students in their trainings, and then going on to do a bachelor's degree and even a master's degree. And you take any number of examples, and people who have gone from working at 2,000 rupees a month to then 10,000 and 30,000. And we've seen how that individual has personally changed her family, and then also gone into an organization and changed the organization because they're bringing an upgraded set of skills. And so you have to invest in people, because unless we invest in the people there, our job should be to be obsolete. And so we should be empowering people to develop skills and take on development work in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Meera. Kumaran, what are your thoughts? What's your message to the people?
My fundraising team hates putting me in front of anyone because I simply can't ask for money, which I can't do on this thing. It's a horrible. That tells you how. Yeah. Anyways, the only thing I would say is, and this might be a little bit of the brown saviour coming out, is apathy is non-negotiable. I think every single person needs to be involved in some capacity or another, and I don't mean just money. There are tons of young people who don't have the financial means to give, but I always tell them, you too have something to give back in terms of your skill, your thought, just your connection to people back home. So for me, the big message is to the people out there is apathy is absolutely non-negotiable. The time is now. The opportunity, the window that we have is in this generation. As much as we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, the opportunity to pivot and to make that generational transformation is now. So let's not lose that window.
I think that's a good place as any to end this conversation. This has been fantastic. Thank you, each of you, for spending this last hour with me. It's been great hearing all of your insights, and I hope all our viewers and listeners out there over the worldwide interweb took something away from this conversation, and hopefully we addressed some questions that you may have understandably had. I know I sure had them. So it's great to be able to hear from the source and hear your thoughts on it. So thank you very much. My name is Jessica Jesudasan. It's been a pleasure being with all of you. With me is Abarna from Palmera, Dr. Meera Pathmarajah from Visions Global Empowerment, and Kumaran Nadesan from comdu.it. Until next time, I guess we'll see you guys when we see you. Take care.
Thanks for having us. Bye now.